The crow's still disrupting the flight. When pilots discover the reason, they decide to land immediately. The morning sun slowly rises over Chicago, casting warm rays on O'Hare International Airport. Jack Thompson, an experienced pilot with graying temples, walks confidently towards the terminal. His eyes, despite years of service fatigue, still sparkle with a passion for flying. Beside him walks Mike Johnson, a young co-pilot whose enthusiasm is almost palpable. "Ready for another routine flight to Atlanta?" asks Jack, smiling slightly. Mike nods eagerly. "Always, Captain. This is one of my first commercial flights, and I want to give it my all." Entering the terminal, they pass a group of passengers. Among them, a middle-aged woman with a keen gaze and a notebook in hand stands out. This is Dr. Sarah Miller, a renowned ornithologist on her way to a conference on bird migration. "Fascinating how these creatures can cover such vast distances," she muses to herself, reviewing her notes. Not far from her stands Kevin Wilson, a man of unassuming appearance, clutching his carry-on bag tightly. His eyes nervously scan the surroundings, as if looking for potential danger. "Subscribe to the channel and experience every moment with us." Jack and Mike pass through security and head to the cockpit. They check systems, preparing for the flight. The weather is ideal, the sky cloudless. "Looks like we'll have a smooth flight," Jack comments, reviewing the weather forecasts. Mike nods, but something inside him suggests that this day might be different from all others. Passengers take their seats. Dr. Miller sits by the window, still engrossed in her notes. Kevin Wilson occupies a seat in the middle row, his bag safely tucked under the seat in front of him. The flight attendant begins the standard safety procedure, but few passengers pay attention. For most, it's just another routine flight. The plane's engines come to life, and the machine slowly moves towards the runway. Jack and Mike exchange final remarks before takeoff. "Control tower, this is Flight 237 to Atlanta, ready for takeoff," Jack reports. "Flight 237, you have permission for takeoff. Wind is calm, visibility excellent. Have a good flight," the controller responds. The plane gains speed on the runway. Mike feels the familiar rush of adrenaline as the machine lifts off the ground. They rise above Chicago, leaving behind a city waking up to life. As they reach cruising altitude, Mike allows himself a moment of relaxation. He looks at the calm sky ahead and thinks it will be just another ordinary flight. He doesn't yet know how wrong he is. In the passenger cabin, Dr. Miller looks out the window, admiring the view. Suddenly, her attention is drawn to something unusual, a group of birds flying at an unnaturally high altitude. She frowns, reaching for her notebook. Kevin Wilson sits stiffly in his seat, his hands clenched on the armrests. Every now and then he nervously glances at the overhead compartment where he placed his bag. The flight attendant begins the in-flight service, the beverage cart slowly moving down the aisle. Passengers chat quietly, some read, others doze off. Everything seems normal, but there's an unspoken tension in the air, as if nature itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. In the cockpit, Mike notices something strange on the radar. A small flashing dot appears and disappears without a clear pattern. The young co-pilot blinks a few times, wondering if it's not an illusion caused by fatigue. "Captain," he begins uncertainly, "could you take a look at this?" Jack leans over to examine the radar. His experienced eyes search for the source of Mike's concern. He mutters, frowning. "It's probably just a system malfunction, but we'll keep an eye on it." Mike nods, not entirely convinced. Something tells him this is just the beginning. Meanwhile, deep in the plane's cargo hold, in Kevin Wilson's luggage, something starts emitting a barely audible signal. A signal that will soon change the course of this seemingly ordinary flight. The plane glided smoothly through the blue sky, and passengers were slowly getting accustomed to the rhythm of the flight. However, in the cockpit, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense. Mike couldn't stop thinking about the strange signal on the radar. "Captain," he spoke again, "that signal has reappeared." Jack furrowed his brow, leaning over the screen. Indeed, the mysterious dot flickered for a moment, only to disappear again. "This is unusual," Jack admitted. "Let's check the communication systems." As Mike reached for the radio to contact air traffic control, He heard only static and noise. "Something's interfering with our communications," he said worriedly. At the same time, in the passenger cabin, Dr. Sarah Miller noticed something extraordinary outside the window. A group of crows was flying at an altitude far exceeding their normal range. "This is impossible," she whispered to herself, frantically jotting down her observations. Near her, Kevin Wilson fidgeted uneasily in his seat. His eyes kept darting towards the overhead compartment where his bag rested. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cabin being cool. Suddenly, as if in response to the growing tension, a strange sound passed through the fuselage of the plane. It resembled a gentle scratching, as if something was sliding along the outer shell of the aircraft. Passengers began to look around uneasily. An elderly lady sitting next to Dr. Miller asked, "Did you hear that too?" Sarah nodded, her scientific mind already analyzing possible causes. "It sounds like," she began, but trailed off, not wanting to incite panic. In the cockpit, Jack and Mike were frantically checking systems. "Everything seems to be functioning normally," Jack stated, "but these communication disruptions are concerning." Mike switched frequencies, trying to establish contact with any control tower. "Could it be a solar storm?" he suggested, though he wasn't convinced of this theory himself. Jack shook his head. There were no warnings about solar activity. It must be something else. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, the flight attendant noticed Kevin's strange behavior. She approached him with a smile. "Is everything all right, sir? Can I help you with anything?" Kevin jumped as if startled out of a trance. No, everything's fine," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Dr. Miller, observing this exchange, felt that something was amiss. Her researcher's instinct told her that all these strange events must be connected. Suddenly, without warning, all electronic devices on the plane began to malfunction. Screens flickered. Phones turned on and off by themselves, and watches stopped at the same moment. Panic began to grip the passengers. "What's happening? Is this normal? Are we safe?" Questions echoed throughout the cabin. Jack, seeing the growing unrest, decided to address the passengers over the PA system. "Dear passengers, we apologize for the temporary disturbances. Please remain calm. Our crew is working on resolving the issue." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, he wasn't sure if they truly had control of the situation. Dr. Miller, unable to sit idly by any longer, stood up. "Excuse me," she addressed the flight attendant. "Could I speak with the captain? I think my observations might be relevant." The flight attendant hesitated, but, seeing the determination in Sarah's eyes, nodded. "Please follow me." As Dr. Miller made her way towards the cockpit, Kevin Wilson started to panic. His hands trembled, and his eyes darted around the cabin, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. At that moment, the plane entered a zone of turbulence. These weren't ordinary bumps. The aircraft behaved as if something was pulling it in different directions simultaneously. Jack fought with the controls, trying to maintain course. "Mike, check the fuel level," he shouted as another wave of turbulence shook the plane. The young co-pilot paled, looking at the indicators. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Captain, we're losing fuel much faster than we should be." Outside, the sky began to darken, even though it was only midday. Clouds were forming into unnatural shapes, and in the distance, strange, almost metallic sounds could be heard. Dr. Miller, now standing in the cockpit doorway, looked at all this with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Captain," she said, drawing the crew's attention, "I think I know what's happening, but I'm afraid you won't believe me just by my word." Jack looked at her, his face tense with the effort of maintaining control over the machine. "At this point, Doctor, I'm ready to believe anything." Sarah took a deep breath. "What surrounds us are not ordinary atmospheric phenomena. This is something much more extraordinary, and I fear that the source of all this might be on board our plane." At that moment, another wave of turbulence shook the aircraft, and a dull thud was heard from the cargo hold. Whatever was happening, it was clear that their flight had turned into a fight for survival. The cockpit of the plane pulsed with the red light of the low fuel alarm. Jack Thompson, sweat on his forehead, analyzed the situation. Beside him, Mike Johnson frantically checked maps, looking for the nearest place to land. "Captain, we have a problem," said Mike, his voice trembling. "The nearest airport is too far away. We won't make it with our current fuel level." Jack clenched his jaw. "We need to find an alternative. Check for areas where we could make an emergency landing." Dr. Sarah Miller, still in the cockpit, watched the situation with growing concern. "What about the passengers? How long can we keep the severity of the situation from them?" "Not long," Jack replied. "But before we cause panic, we need to have a plan." In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was tense. Although the strange phenomena had subsided, passengers sensed that something was wrong. They whispered among themselves, casting nervous glances toward the cockpit. Kevin Wilson sat hunched in his seat, surrounded by 2 crew members who were guarding him after the incident with the control device. His face was pale, and his eyes were full of fear and guilt. A flight attendant approached him, holding a small box she had found in his carry-on luggage. "Sir, can you tell me what this is?" Kevin looked at the box and sighed heavily. It's the cause of all this. I didn't know it would end up like this. I thought it was just a simple experiment." At that moment, Jack's voice came over the intercom. "Dear passengers, please pay attention. Due to unexpected circumstances, we are forced to change our route. Please remain calm and follow the crew's instructions." Dr. Miller, hearing this announcement, turned to Jack. "Captain, I think we should learn more about this device. It might help us find a solution." Jack nodded. "You're right. Mike, take the controls. I'll go talk to our guest." As Jack entered the passenger cabin, all eyes turned to him. He approached Kevin, who shrank even more at his sight. "Sir," Jack began in a calm but firm tone, "we need explanations. What exactly were you carrying in your luggage?" Kevin swallowed hard. It's a prototype device for communicating with birds. It uses specific frequencies that birds can receive and respond to." Dr. Miller, who had followed Jack, interjected, "But why crows? And why at such a high altitude? It wasn't meant to be used this way," Kevin explained, his voice full of regret. "It was supposed to be a small-scale experiment, but something went wrong. The device started emitting a much stronger signal than it should have." Jack frowned. "And what about the fuel loss and interference with our systems?" Kevin shook his head. "I'm not sure. Maybe the electromagnetic field generated by the device somehow affected the plane's systems. It wasn't intentional, I swear." At that moment, the plane entered another zone of turbulence. Passengers screamed in terror, and Jack had to hold on to keep his balance. "Captain," Mike's voice came over the radio, "we have a problem. The engines are losing power again." Jack cast one last look at Kevin and ran back to the cockpit. Dr. Miller followed him, her mind working at full speed. "Mike, what's going on?" Jack asked, taking his seat. "I don't know," the young co-pilot replied. "It's as if something is draining energy from the engines. The indicators are going crazy." Dr. Miller leaned over the control panel. "This is impossible. Unless what?" Jack asked, struggling with the controls. "Unless Kevin's device wasn't completely turned off," Sarah said. "Maybe it's still emitting some kind of signal that's interfering with our systems." Jack cursed under his breath. "But I turned it off." "Maybe it has some kind of fail-safe," Sarah suggested. "A mechanism that activates when the main power is cut off." At that moment, Mike shouted, "Captain, look!" In front of them, in the distance, a huge cloud of birds appeared. Not just crows, but hundreds of different species, all flying towards them. "This is impossible," Dr. Miller whispered. "These birds shouldn't be able to fly at this altitude." Jack knew they had to act quickly. "Mike, try to avoid that cloud. Sarah, go to Kevin and find out how to completely deactivate that device. I'll try to find a place for an emergency landing." As Sarah rushed to the passenger cabin and Mike maneuvered the plane, Jack began scanning the terrain below them. They needed to find a safe place to land, and fast. In the distance, he noticed a large field that could serve as a makeshift runway. It was their only choice. "Mike, prepare for an emergency landing," Jack said, his voice full of determination. "We only have one chance. We have to do this right." The plane began its descent, while outside the windows a storm of birds raged, and in the cargo hold, the mysterious device still emitted its fatal signal. The fate of the passengers and crew hung in the balance, and the ground was approaching with each passing second. The plane trembled, cutting through the air lower and lower. Jack Thompson, with hands tightly gripping the controls, stared at the approaching field. It was their only chance for survival. "Mike, prepare to lower the landing gear," he said, his voice tense but controlled. "We'll do it on my signal." The young co-pilot nodded, sweat running down his face. "Yes, Captain." In the passenger cabin, Dr. Sarah Miller knelt beside Kevin Wilson's seat, frantically examining the mysterious device. "Mr. Wilson, you must remember, is there any way to completely shut down this device?" Kevin, pale as a sheet, shook his head. "I don't know. It was a prototype. We never tested it under these conditions." Sarah clenched her teeth in frustration. She knew time was running out. Suddenly, her gaze fell on a small, almost unnoticeable slit in the device's casing. What's this?" Kevin squinted. That's the safety key slot, but I lost it during the commotion." Sarah looked around frantically. Her eyes landed on the bird-shaped brooch she wore on her jacket lapel. Without hesitation, she tore it off and inserted it into the slot. The device sparked and went dark. At that same moment, the cloud of birds that had surrounded the plane began to disperse. The birds, as if awakened from a trance, flew off in all directions. "Captain," Sarah shouted through the intercom. "We did it. The device is off." Jack breathed a sigh of relief, but he knew this wasn't the end of their problems. "Good job, Sarah, but we still need to land safely. Mike, how's the fuel situation?" "Critical, Captain," Mike replied. "We have fuel for a maximum of 5 minutes of flight." Jack nodded. "It'll have to be enough. Prepare for emergency landing." Sarah informed the passengers. Dr. Miller grabbed the microphone. "Dear passengers, better please pay attention. We will be making an emergency landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts, lean forward, and cover your head with your hands. Remember, we're in this together." A silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the sobs of some passengers. Kevin Wilson sat with his face hidden in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The plane was approaching the ground faster and faster. Jack fought with the controls, trying to keep the machine under control. "Mike, lower the landing gear, now!" With a loud screech, the landing gear extended. The ground was so close now that Jack could make out individual blades of grass in the field. "Hold on," he shouted, as the wheels touched the ground. The plane bounced, kicking up clouds of dust and grass. Passengers screamed as the machine shook and jumped on the uneven surface. Jack and Mike fought with the controls, trying to keep the plane in a straight line. Suddenly, a loud crack came from the right side. One of the landing gear wheels had broken under the pressure. The plane tilted dangerously, threatening to tip over. "Left engines at full power!" Jack shouted. Mike immediately executed the command, and the plane slowly began to straighten out. The machine slid across the field, leaving a deep furrow behind it. Slowly, very slowly, it began to decelerate. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the plane came to a stop. For a moment, absolute silence reigned in the cabin, and then eruptions of relief and joy broke out. Passengers cried, laughed, and hugged each other. Jack slumped back in his seat, feeling the adrenaline slowly leaving his body. Mike sat beside him, staring in disbelief at the field in front of them. "We did it," the young co-pilot whispered. "We really did it." Jack put his hand on Mike's shoulder. "Good job, son. You're an excellent pilot." Dr. Sarah Miller entered the cockpit, her face lit up with a smile of relief. "Captain, all passengers are safe. No serious injuries." Jack nodded. "Thank you, Sarah. Your help was invaluable." As they opened the plane's doors and passengers began to exit onto the field, Kevin Wilson approached Jack. His face was wet with tears. "Captain," he began in a trembling voice, I'm sorry. I had no idea this device could cause so many problems. I'm ready to face the consequences." Jack looked at him seriously. "Mr. Wilson, What you did was irresponsible and dangerous. But in the end, you helped us solve the problem. Now we need to focus on ensuring the safety of all passengers. In the distance, the sirens of emergency services approaching the landing site could already be heard. Helicopters circled overhead, and police and fire department vehicles could be seen on the horizon. Jack stepped out of the plane and stood in the field, surrounded by crew and passengers. Everyone looked at him with gratitude and admiration. "Thank you all for your courage and cooperation," he said. "Together we survived something that seemed impossible." As rescue services arrived on the scene and began tending to the passengers, Jack looked at his crew. He knew this experience had bonded them forever. Whatever the future might bring, they were ready to face it, together. And above the field where the plane had landed, a few solitary crows circled, as if bidding farewell to the extraordinary adventure that had just come to an end. The field where the plane had landed was teeming with life. The lights of ambulances and fire trucks flashed, and the air was filled with the hum of helicopters. Passengers, still dazed but grateful for their survival, were being examined by paramedics. Captain Jack Thompson stood at the edge of the field, observing the commotion. His uniform was rumpled, and his face showed fatigue, but pride and relief shone in his eyes. Mike Johnson, the young co-pilot who had just finished talking to the police, approached him. "Captain," Mike began, "the officers want to talk to you. They're asking about the flight details and, well, all those strange events." Jack sighed. "I expected that. I wonder how we'll explain the flying crows and the mysterious device to them." At that moment, Dr. Sarah Miller approached them. Her usually neat appearance was somewhat disheveled, but her eyes sparkled with scientific excitement. "Captain, I've just been talking to representatives from the Institute for Animal Behavior Research. They're extremely interested in Kevin's device and its potential applications. Of course, under strict control." Jack raised his eyebrows. "Really? I thought that device would be immediately confiscated and destroyed." Sarah shook her head. "Not entirely. They see potential in it for studying bird migration and protecting endangered species. Of course, after appropriate modifications and safeguards." Mike looked around nervously. "And what about Kevin? Where is he?" "He's being questioned by the police," Sarah answered. "But from what I've heard, he'll likely avoid serious charges. After all, he didn't have bad intentions, and he even helped solve the problem." Jack nodded. "That's good. I hope this situation will teach him to be more cautious in future experiments." Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a commotion of excited voices. A group of journalists was heading towards the field, with microphones and cameras at the ready. "Oh no," Mike groaned. "The media is already here." Jack straightened up and adjusted his tie. "Stay calm, Mike. We need to maintain professionalism. Sarah, would you like to join us? Your expertise might be invaluable in explaining some aspects of this incident." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "I'd be glad to wait, Captain." As the journalists reached them, questions began pouring in. "Captain Thompson, how do you comment on reports of unidentified flying objects around the plane?" "Dr. Miller, is it true that crows were attacking the plane? How is that possible at such an altitude? Were the passengers in danger? How did you manage to land safely?" Jack raised his hands, asking for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand your interest. What happened was unusual and unprecedented, but the most important thing is that all passengers and crew members are safe." Sarah added, "What we witnessed was an extraordinary phenomenon related to bird behavior, caused by an experimental device. The details are still being investigated, but I assure you it was nothing supernatural." Mike, gaining courage, also spoke up. "I'd like to emphasize the professionalism of our crew and the cooperation of the passengers. It was thanks to a joint effort that we managed to land safely." The journalists absorbed every word, taking notes and recording everything. Jack knew this story would be on the front pages of newspapers for many days. As the press conference continued, Jack noticed a group of passengers gathered nearby. They looked at him with gratitude and admiration. Among them stood Kevin Wilson, with his head bowed, but visibly relieved that no one was accusing him. When the journalists finally dispersed, Jack approached the passengers. "How is everyone feeling?" he asked with concern. An elderly lady stepped forward. "Captain, we wanted to thank you. You and your crew saved our lives." Other passengers nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Jack felt emotion tightening his throat. "It was a joint effort," he said modestly. "Each of you behaved incredibly bravely." Kevin Wilson approached uncertainly. "Captain, I wanted to apologize. I didn't realize the consequences of my actions." Jack put a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Wilson, the most important thing is that you've learned from this situation. I hope you'll be more careful in your research in the future." As the sun began to set, the field slowly emptied. Passengers were being taken to hotels where they would spend the night before returning home. The plane, though damaged, was to be transported to a hangar for detailed examination. Jack, Hugh, Mike, and Sarah stood together, watching the setting sun. They were tired, but felt satisfaction from a job well done. "What now?" Mike asked. Jack smiled slightly. "Now, my young friend, we have a lot of paperwork ahead of us. But first, I think we all deserve a proper rest," Sarah laughed. "And maybe a glass of wine to celebrate our extraordinary experience." "Definitely," Jack agreed. But first, we need to make sure all passengers are safe and cared for." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, the trio of heroes headed towards the vehicles waiting for them. They knew their adventure had come to an end, but its consequences would be felt for a long time to come. And high in the sky, a solitary crow flew over the field, as if bidding farewell to the extraordinary story of which it had been an unwitting participant. And his experience and composure in a crisis situation had become legendary in the industry. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Mike Johnson entered the office, no longer the young and unsure co-pilot, but a confident first officer. "Good morning, Captain," he greeted with a smile. "I came for the final instructions before our flight to New York tomorrow." Jack smiled warmly. "Mike, how many times do I have to tell you to call me by my first name, especially now that you're my son-in-law?" Mike laughed. "Sorry, it's a habit. Emily keeps reminding me about it." The mention of his daughter brought a smile to Jack's face. Who would have thought that the dramatic events of that day would lead to a romance between his daughter and the young pilot? "By the way," Mike added, "Dr. Miller called. She wants to meet with us before tomorrow's press conference." Jack nodded. "All right, let's meet at the airport cafe. And what's new with our friend, Kevin Wilson?" Mike smiled meaningfully. "Well, his bird device, after appropriate modifications, turned out to be a breakthrough in bird migration research. I heard he's been nominated for an Environmental Protection Award." "Who would have thought?" Jack muttered. A potential disaster gave birth to success. The next day in the airport cafe, Jack, Mike, and Dr. Sarah Miller sat at a table, sipping coffee and reminiscing about the events from a year ago. "I can't believe it's been a year already," Sarah sighed. "So much has changed." Jack nodded. "That's true. Our experience led to many changes in flight safety protocols. Now every plane is equipped with sensors detecting electromagnetic anomalies, and my research on bird behavior in extreme conditions has gained worldwide recognition," Sarah added proudly, "all thanks to being on board that fateful flight." Mike looked at his companions with admiration. "You know, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't flown that day. Our lives would have taken a completely different course." "That's true," Jack agreed. "Thanks, but the most important thing is how we used this experience. We not only survived, but we became better people and professionals." Sarah raised her cup in a toast to new horizons and unexpected adventures. Jack and Mike joined the toast, and their laughter filled the cafe. An hour later, they stood before a crowd of journalists, ready for the press conference on the anniversary of the memorable flight. Jack stepped forward and began his speech. "A year ago, we experienced something that seemed impossible. We faced the unknown, fought for survival, and came out stronger. But the most important lesson we learned from that day is that together, we can overcome any obstacle." Mike added, "Our adventure showed how important cooperation, trust, and keeping a cool head in the face of danger are. These values have become the foundation of our approach to flight safety." Sarah concluded, "And for the world of science, This experience opened new paths of research and innovation. It showed us how much we still have to learn about the world around us. After the conference, when the crowd of journalists had dispersed, the three friends stood on the observation deck, watching planes taking off and landing. "You know," Jack began, "I think our story could inspire many people. Maybe we should share it with a wider audience." Sarah and Mike looked at him with interest. "What do you have in mind?" Mike asked. Jack smiled mysteriously. "Well, I know someone who runs a podcast about extraordinary life stories. Maybe we could appear there and share our experience." Sarah clapped her hands enthusiastically. "That's a great idea. We could reach people all over the world and show them that even in the strangest circumstances, you can find strength and hope," Mike added. Jack nodded. "Exactly. And who knows? Maybe our stories will inspire others to share their own tales of survival and triumph." As the sun began to set, the three friends looked at the horizon where the sky met the earth. Their extraordinary adventure had come to an end, but its echo still resonated in their lives and in the lives of many other people. And somewhere high above them, a flock of crows flew on their mysterious path, reminding them that the world is full of wonders and surprises waiting to be discovered. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Jack, Mike, and Sarah has touched your hearts and inspired you. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally fascinating stories. You can find it here, clicking on the left side. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a thumbs up to this episode. We bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of life every day. Don't miss our upcoming materials. We're waiting for your comments.